No one knows what's going on, right? You speak with folks who try to track these tariffs, and it would say, where do I start? Because honestly, I don't know either.
No.
Well, we're going to see a lot of fluctuation over the coming months. And if there's one thing I can say with relative certainty, it might be, very, very smart tactics. I don't deny that. But I really don't think there is a coherent grand strategy at work here.
Welcome to the Tao of Chao podcast, where we will try to find balance and provide a clearer path forward in this uncertain world. Brian Wong is an assistant professor in philosophy at the Hong Kong University. He is a political theorist and geopolitical strategist whose research examines authoritarian regimes and citizens' political and moral responsibilities, colonial and historical injustices, and interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy of states in East Asia, especially China. Brian is a Hong Kong Rhodes Scholar. He obtained his doctorate in philosophy and politics at Oxford University. He holds a master in philosophy and political theory with distinction from Wolfson College, University of Oxford, and a master MA in philosophy, politics, and economics, first class, from Pembroke College, University of Oxford, with the latter being funded fully by a Koch scholarship. He is the most sought after speaker on geopolitics and the influence of technology. And here is Brian. Well, first of all, Brian, thank you so much for joining me. Of course, we have 12 hours difference, but hopefully our minds are connected through time, and that there's no difference night or day, that we're going to have a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much for having me on your program, Philip. It's a great privilege and honor, and I'm very excited about the conversation.
You are truly the expert in the geopolitical sense, especially in Asia. And in my opinion, what's going on from the Trump administration, we call it affectionately known as Trump 2.0, and all the, I guess we can start live at Liberation Day, where we all feel liberated, that at the end of the day, with the 90-day pushback of application to all the countries with the exception of China at 145%, I think the truth is coming out that this is all substantially aimed at China more than anybody else. That's not to say that nobody else is going to get affected, but the main target, perhaps one can suggest, is US and China, which is really a continuation of a theme that has been going on for, I would say, a decade or longer, if not since Obama, the famous pivot to Asia. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Brian, as sort of a macro first start out, and thinking about how do you consider this process right now in terms of the geopolitical as well as economic framework from Asian standpoint? That could be ASEAN, it could be China, just sort of away from United States where you sit or where you sleep, where I'm not. How are you looking at all this today as you think back to Liberation Day till now? What are some of your thoughts on this?
When thinking about the state of the world today, I see myself as really gravitating towards the following three observations. And the first observation is that the unipole remains present, but is by no means the only dominant force that exists. The second thought I have is essentially the world is trending towards more complexity, but not necessarily just yet, is not as of yet a multipolar world, so to speak. So there's more complexity, more multipolarity, but we're far from true multipolarity. Mm-hmm. And yet the third observation I have is that the biggest enemies and the biggest rivals to both China and America are plausibly themselves as opposed to one another. Mm-hmm. And so I want to unpack sort of each and every one of these points step by step, really. Starting first with a comment on unipolarity. Yeah. When I speak with my American friends, many of them are undergoing the incredible turmoil and malaise of the society, and they see it from different perspectives. More conservative and perhaps Trump sympathizing friends of mine would say that the moral order of America is frayed and fractured, even though, of course, one could raise very reasonable questions over the ethics of President Trump himself, and also whether or not his return is, in fact, not a harbinger, as opposed to a sort of a remedy to the malaise that we see right now with regards to the fraying of communal and social ties in America. On the other hand, my many liberal friends would tell me, well, America is going to the doldrums right now because it doesn't have efficacious governance. It is run by a bunch of kleptocratic and inept and also fundamentally corrupt politicians. And that charge, ironically, also resembles the allegations we hear from the right of the spectrum. So you see, there's a lot of disgruntlement and grievances towards the political elite. And by extension, you throw into the mix there the socioeconomic inequalities, the gutting of the manufacturing sector arising from automation, globalization, and also, of course, the Triffin dilemma, which is a concept I'll return to later as we explore the Mar-a-Lago Accord, right? Yeah. These are all issues that America has to contend with. And I do not want to gloss over the fact that the stakes have never been higher for America. The amount of polarization, vitriol, and putrid politics that is really playing out in each and every level across each and every stratum of the political system. These are all very, very concerning signs. And yet, at the end of the day, let's not forget the fact that America by far remains the dominant military power in the world. It's got over 750 military bases, worldwide, whereas its closest rival, including, of course, China, and many of its closest rivals could barely count as having 1/100th of that in terms of actual official numbers, or indeed a 1/7 of that, even if you were to count all the sort of unofficial and the tacitly countable numbers, which I see as somewhat spurious anyways. In short, by extent of span, of reach, of intensity, and also total military spending in absolute terms, America leads. Financially, again, this talk of de-dollarization gets a lot of people very excited and hyped up, and myself sometimes included. I too want to see a world where no country ought to fear over their own decisions and look over their backs simply in virtue of the ability of some other powers to jeopardize, right, their autonomy by threatening sanctions, by weaponizing the currency, and also by shutting them out of the international financial order constructed on the basis of one currency. That is a dream that many countries deserve to have and should have and do have. And yet, in practice, the American dollar remains the preferred choice for the global reserve currency for now in 2025. We'll see what happens with the bond markets and also if Donald Trump's tenure is sufficient in upending this. But I certainly think that as it stands, America still leads, on that very front in being the source and provider of the greenback, which is something that folks would turn to independently of any further ties and also of its being cashed out in terms of or relative to some underlying commodity. Ever since Nixon undertook that radical move, right, of establishing a clean breakaway from the gold standard, the American dollar has basically largely been a default currency by fiat, not by its ties and tethering to gold, but instead, by fiat. Based on and riding off the credibility of the Fed and also the institutions that render America so powerful in essentially positioning America as the dominant hegemonic financial power in the world, especially when you look at the fact that post-1991, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, America has basically been the country that's been calling the shots, directing the movements of capital flows, investment, and trade across the world, not just in the global north, not just in relation to the global south, but across the world. And no other power, even as of today, comes close to America on many of these incredibly important dimensions. The world remains unipolar, but I would also say that it is trending towards more complexity, more multipolarity. In China, we've seen over the 40 years, the short 40 to 45 years since opening up and reform commenced, we've seen drastic transformations to the country's economy, with its GDP, total GDP, increasing, by almost 40 times, depending on your metric of measurement, with its average GDP per capita, again, increasing by a substantial volume, over the past few decades, with its citizens getting substantially richer, and also the quality of life, undertaking great leaps and bounds, really, so to speak. And as it stands, China now trades with nearly as many, if not more, countries in the world as their dominant trading partners than America. So it goes to show that when it comes to supply chains and trade and commerce, China has indeed developed a pretty sizable, track record and legacy, and is on a trajectory, right? Provided that protectionism doesn't rear its ugly heads across a vast majority of countries, to continually be a supply chain powerhouse. But even that alone is insufficient in offsetting the financial wherewithal, the military prowess, and all the other edges that America still wields over China, right? Similarly, you might point to Russia and the European Union as competing poles with clearly divergent interests, especially Russia, from the USA. And in the case of the EU, it's more, as a result of or in virtue of American erraticism, but also clear vacillations in the White House's policy that's compelled a rethinking on a part of the EU. So there is indeed a desire for more autonomy on a part of the EU, and in the case of Russia, a sort of revanchism, a kind of, almost a trenchant and defiant desire to reimagine the post-Cold War order, to reclaim the so-called rightful place for Russia on a global stage. And these are all signs that the American tune is no longer something that is adopted without question, without pushback and resistance across the world. And I haven't even gone on to countries in ASEAN and also the Gulf, which have tried very hard to and are likely to struggle, but would still seek to do their very best in hedging, in not choosing between China or the US, in not aligning themselves with exclusively one or two party as it stands. And that's why, in relation to the war in Ukraine, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as I would like to remind people of what's really happening there, as opposed to euphemizing it, a large number of countries, right, in the global south did not necessarily align themselves 100% with the sort of global north European position vis-a-vis the war, despite also protesting the fact that the infringement of Ukraine's sovereignty ought to be called out, because they too are concerned about the implications of large powers acting with impunity without checks and balances. And the same could be said, of course, of the devastating events unfolding right now in Gaza. Again, some would say this revealed the hypocrisy and double standards of the West, whereas others would say, at the very least, this has driven a wedge between Muslim-majority countries and also the West. But the reality is more nuanced and complex. If you went to the Arab states and spoke with politicians there, leaders and economic figures, and also business persons there, they would definitely tell you that they harbor a strong preference for the Abraham Accords and to be continually advanced and pushed forward and expanded. So again, there's no neat and simple answers to a lot of these questions of geopolitics. And that ties me very quickly onto the final point I want to make in answering your question. I believe China and the US, the worst enemies to both of them respectively are themselves. And I'll start first with China very quickly. I don't think the Chinese have much to fear in relation to the US, and that's for the simple fact that the US remains so internally divided, internally stratified as it stands, that despite its attempting to pull out all its stops to deter and inhibit China's rise, the Trump administration could never really detract from the fundamentals that lean in favor of China's strategic rise. And that is, firstly, its comparative and absolute advantages in advanced manufacturing. Secondly, the amount of catch-up growth that can be achieved through urbanization and improvements in higher education access, and also overarching literacy as well as social safety net that the Chinese administration can easily implement measures over the coming years to tackle seriously, if only they mustered enough political will and resolve to overcome the huge amount of internal inertia and intransigence that's holding them back. And finally, and very quickly, China's greatest strength ultimately lies with its national and societal solidarity. And this is not just a purely cultural or sociological fact. It is also a product of this system, which is incredibly top-down when it comes to political and ideological leadership and shaping or engineering, but at the same time quite organically bottom-up when it comes to more technocratic and also more mundane issues of decision-making. And this narrative that the Chinese system is this sort of huge, humongous blob of a dictatorial regime, I don't think that holds much truth in it, simply because this ignores the importance of the bureaucracy as well as the complexity of grassroots governance within this said bureaucracy that comprises China today. Similarly, America. Many of my American friends would say, what's happening right now in America is a result of foreign actors, the Russians, the Chinese, so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to cast too much doubt on a Russian hypothesis, because I certainly think there's something interesting there about Russian involvement. But on a Chinese front, right, I just do not think it is fair to attribute the product of the American financial system and the Triffin dilemma towards an opinion on any particular country. And that is to say, the US dollar, in order for it to be the dominant reserve currency of the world, there needs to be use cases for the US dollar. And that is why the American administration and American establishment has long prided itself for being a net importer, because it is only through running a net import deficit or trade account deficit could there be a net positive when it comes to the exporting of the US dollar. And the American dollar is the most powerful export of America today. So until that facet of American economic and global strategic policy changes, it's almost futile slapping tariffs on any particular country, right? Because the Americans can slap tariffs on goods from China, but then American consumers would just import more from, say, Mexico or from Vietnam. Okay, well, maybe Trump slaps tariffs on them too. Okay, then the Americans would turn to other producers of the same goods until they get to a point where it is finally cheaper for them to purchase domestically manufactured goods than importing from abroad. But what kinds of changes to American society would that endpoint require America to undertake in a process of arriving at that stage, right? What kinds of changes are we talking about here with regards to reshaping the workforce, the economic structures, the dismantling of red tape and bureaucracy, which sounds nice in theory until we get into the weeds of, labor rights and protections and opportunity costs and voter preferences, and the fact that most American citizens these days would probably, not be willing to work in the kinds of jobs they want to bring back to America. There was a very interesting survey that came out earlier today, or I was reading, about the results on Twitter, which said over 80% of Americans supported getting manufacturing jobs back to America. But only, I think, 30 to 40%, you need to check the numbers, I'm not sure here, right? I think it was no more than 30%, or maybe even less, who said they would be willing to work in these jobs. So this is another kind of NIMBYism, right? Everyone likes talking about manufacturing jobs in theory, but in practice, they aren't going to follow through. So to me, this is the point.
The big problem is there are not enough peasants who are willing to do little screws on the iPhone.
Tell that to JD Vance.
I'm being very facetiously derogatory, but thank you for that. That was so packed with aspects of what's going on. I think I'm not disagreeing at any of the things you're saying. I think a lot to unpack. We only have 40 minutes. This is a 3 days worth of conversation if we don't sleep at all. So let's. I want to sort of pick on a couple of items that I would like you to elaborate on. I think you talked about. Number one is this, unipolar, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That creates the beginning. Of where we are today being the dominant and the one and only for almost 70 years. So the question is, and I think the Mar-a-Lago Accord by Stephen Miron, and I believe that he gave a speech at the Hudson Institute, which is a right-leaning organization.
Very right-wing, actually.
Very right-wing, yeah. He spoke about the wonderful benefits that the United States had given almost freely to the world. Shall we say both the privilege and the burden. Of number one is offering peace and prosperity for the whole world. And number two, at the back of the working men and women of America, that we have been subsidizing all these costs from military to financial to allowing U.S. Be the reserve currency as if they volunteered it in any way. But of course, as you know, back in the day when Bretton Woods are around, it was they who decided that they being United States currency, being pegged to gold, which you mentioned already, that should be the currency of choice and should be the currency that everyone deals with. And then, of course, Nixon, before this end of the gold relationship pegged to gold. And it also made the deal with Saudi Arabia to say, well, then all the transaction in oil should be settled in U.S. dollars, if you recall. So those are just a few examples. When I listen to that, it sounds somewhat one-sided. Regardless his examples are absolutely correct or not. I mean, I don't think there's too many absolutes in our discussions here. What's your thought about the other side, the tremendous, I believe, benefits that you have gotten being the reserve currency and being the hegemon? Can you share a little bit about that just to bring the balance of discussion to the audience?
I want to begin by saying that I have no doubt that there has been an underbelly of globalization in America that's lost out, who are victims, who are clear victims, whether it be in terms of the relative deprivation they feel, the opportunity loss they feel, or the status, deranking and also lowering of self-perceived status or actual status. I think these are all dimensions along which, right, there's been a clear group of losers and who are not losers in a sort of normatively laden sense, but losers in virtue of folks who have lost out, right, over the past few decades. I'm going to just start by saying I do not deny their existence, nor do I deny the right to be angry, to feel righteously angry, to feel aggrieved. But what I would say is the roots of the problems that these individuals are encountering today are the elite, are the very elite who decided in the early 1970s that America would no longer follow and indeed would put an end to the Bretton Woods regime, that America would indeed prosper and benefit off globalization as an overarching trade directive and policy, as one in which American capital would not only be wielded to secure gains from investment perspectives for domestic investors and also capital-rich individuals, but also to extract geopolitical and also territorial or resource, rather, concessions from powers abroad. And the elite who have made these decisions are also, ironically, the very individuals who are benefiting in many ways the most from the current upheaval, from market making, from investing into and ensuring and longing and ensuring and longing so and so forth stocks, but also in producing this false consciousness that convinces the workers that, don't blame us, there's a boogeyman that we can blame, and that's got China, So that's the first comment I'll make. I do agree that there have been unjust losers and victims, but I do not think it is fair to lay the blame at the feet of any particular power, China, Vietnam, Philippines, India. No. It is unfair insofar as, this is a conscious, deliberate choice made by the American elite, and secondly, they've long been in a position where they could fix this problem and chose not to, and chose to gloss over it, and chose to sort of, really talk up ideals that seem so fundamentally Pollyannish in practice, and yet so melodious in theory, right? They sound lovely, but are just so hard to implement and put into practice, whether it be in a striving towards a society that is wholly race blind, or in advancing a society that recognizes gender and sexual diversity in full. These are ideals I fundamentally believe are very important, and yet the way they've been talked about and executed or have had policies executed in relation to, it's not been efficacious. So my charge isn't so much that the elite, which by the way is a pretty heterogeneous entity, right? They're more progressive elite, they're more liberal elite, they're more conservative, that's the social dimension. They're more libertarian, they're more status elite, that's the economic dimension. There's the pro-immigration, anti-immigration elite, you name it. So clearly there's heterogeneity. But all I'm saying here is that either, the elite have either glossed over many of these long-standing underlying root causes of resentment in America and sought to patch things up, through invoking ideals and also principles that are just poorly explained and even more poorly rationalized for the American people. And that I'm referring to by that, to the new sort of democratic consensus that's arisen since the early 2010s. Alternatively, you look at MAGA, what the MAGA movement is ultimately is a group of pretty well-endowed, privileged elite saying, we're going to employ anti-elite sentiments and exploit populism in order to accrue more political capital. And this is by no means a US-only phenomenon. You look towards the UK, Nigel Farage's movement, Brexit, so to speak, was largely an elite-driven and centered effort to replace and to also push out another group of elite within this sort of internal factionless struggle, or at least an internal struggle within the power elite. It was never a sort of struggle between the people and the elite. That is a narrative, a spin, a deliberately doctored and engineered and fabricated claim to legitimize deeply, deeply disconcerting and economically suicidal measures and moves on a part of a slim majority in the Brexit referendum. And you look further towards the East in Europe, whether it be Orban's conservatism in Hungary or Marine Le Pen, who's recently been banned from running, but she might appeal, her kind of xenophobic far-right conservatism in France. Each and every time folks come out here and say they stand for the people against the elite, I would ask them, no. Are you sure, right? Because I would ask them, are you sure you're standing against the elite? Well, maybe you are standing against the elite that you don't like. Maybe you are standing against the elite who have competing interests from yours and who are your rivals, okay, and peer competitors. But are you truly, and can you truly say that you are a man or woman of the people as opposed to merely another member of the power elite, a sort of disheveled and disillusioned member nonetheless? And just look at Donald Trump. Which part of him speaks to his purported anti-elitism? Is it his uncouth mannerisms? Is it how crass he speaks? I mean, that certainly is, a sign of his intellectual anti-elitism. Yeah. But does that therefore mean he's not a member of the elite? I'm not so sure. So to answer your question, Philip, the final point I'd make here is that the American society as a whole has benefited immensely from the exorbitant privilege, so to speak, right, which goes hand in hand with the Triffin dilemma that I've cited earlier on. The first benefit, that's pretty clear, is cheap consumer goods. Yes. The ability to just enjoy cheap eggs, not anymore, cheap cars, cheap laptops, cheap everything. The American consumer is blessed because they can spend a lot without thinking through the consequences. And that is why savings rate is so much lower in America vis-a-vis many other developed and let alone developing economies in the world. And that's because the American consumer really doesn't have to worry about spending money that they have yet to earn. And that's like a credit card. It's the entire economy is like a credit card for which the repayment period can be indefinitely extended and the can kick down the road, so to speak. And secondly, it's not just about spending, it's also about refinancing. Yes. The American USD bond, treasury bonds that is, have long been the safest assets or amongst the safest assets in the world, at least up until a few weeks ago or a few days ago.
Yes.
And that's to say that in virtue of the preeminence of the dollar, the US government has been able to borrow loads and loads and loads of money without thinking about when and how to repay them. And that has in turn covered everything ranging from, the kind of pretty broken, welfare system, if you'd asked me, all the way through to the infrastructure, which is also ironically pretty broken. But these, again, the brokenness or the dilapidatedness of the infrastructure and the safety net are not the fault of some alien other countries. It is a fault instead of the institutions that allow certain actors to get away without accountability and to act with impunity with regards to the allocation of resources. They have the money, they have the ability to borrow more money. The question is not whether they can, but how are they spending the money that they're borrowing? That's the question I think the American people ought to ask more. And the final point here is, of course, the dominant status of the US dollar has afforded the US geostrategic preeminence, instrumental efficacy, and the ability to prosecute its foreign policy interests and agenda through weaponizing the dollar. No other country in the world, right, can say, I'm going to kick you out of SWIFT if you don't listen. I'm going to freeze all your assets. That's probably 80 to 90% of your wealth if you don't comply. Name me another country that can do that at will, targeting the elite and targeting the powerful and the rich across all corners of the planet. I can't think of any single country that comes remotely close along that metric or along that dimension, so to speak.
I would say that, shall we blame it on the liberal capitalism, that it is the capitalists who have been shifting the manufacturing to the lowest cost provider? Has it not been capitalism? And I'm not against capitalism. I'm just suggesting that you can call them elites, which is absolutely correct. They end up being elites. They were not necessarily born as an elitist. but they became elitist because of the system that rewards the mighty dollar, the ability to make a profit. And because of liberal world order, we can go anywhere, do anything that is in the name of serving our shareholders, serving in the best interests of those that we serve. And so, at the same time, is it fair to suggest that the politicians have failed to, if they didn't recognize it when Japan took over a lot of the industries, they didn't again recognize it when Korea then came in after that, and they again didn't recognize when China came in. When I say came in, is we as a country let them in so that we can manufacture in their countries, or to have them manufacture here. As a result of that, we have been hollowing out the manufacturing sector of this country for the benefit of corporations. Then ultimately they become elites. I'm just thinking out loud. So what I'm really saying is that on the one hand, it was wonderful to have a liberal capitalism. On the other hand, that we did not have a government who is responsive and anticipatory enough to say, as you hollow out, we need to do something about those people who are getting hollowed out, and to retool, re-educate, what have you, to give them the safety net, to give them that lift so that they are not misplaced, and to use what you will call a boogeyman or a boogie nation or anybody else as the easy scapegoat to suggest this is what happened. Is there any validity to what I said, or you would have taken it in a different way?
The American system, Philip, if I may, is the American political system is certainly a system of nominal democracy.
Yes.
And yet the extent to which it is a substantive democracy, that is one that takes seriously the interests and the voices of the people in a decision-making process and grants them equal weightage, I'm skeptical of that claim. Yes. I'm skeptical of the extent to which it is. And that's for a very simple reason. As a complex, federal republic, right, or a federalized institution and system at large, if you look at the electoral college that decides upon the president each and every single 4 years, okay, right? The processes by which an individual must undergo in order to end up on a ballot, to have a chance at winning, to actually win, to eventually become the president or the vice president on that ticket, these are laborious. Yeah. These are high, ultra high difficulty, processes, so to speak. The barriers are insurmountable for 99.9999% of the country. Okay, actually, I'll add a few more nines to that, right? And that is to say, if you start off as, say, a local sort of county candidate, right? Or as someone running for city government and to lead a city government, or to stand for the district and or the board of supervision, say, right, in certain Californian cities, okay? Then you might have to fundraise a couple of million of grand, eliminate opponents within your own primary election. And by elimination, I'm using this word not because, it's a slip of tongue, but because you have to really metaphorically eliminate your opponent by pitching yourself as the preferable candidate within your own primaries on a local level. And you also need to know how to run a media game, and you also need to know how to build a team and assemble a team of social media savvy, maybe tech bros and whatnot, and help you micro-target voters. And that's just a city mayoral election and a primary within that. So the amount of resources you need, the amount of connections you need, the amount of endowments you need is incredible. And so we move this on to the state level. The same could be said for gubernatorial races, for Senate races, right? And let's move it a notch up again to the presidential level. Tell me, how many candidates, right, over the past let's talk about the past 56 years, how many parties have fielded actually viable candidates on a national level? 2, the Democrats and the Republicans. Who calls the shots in these parties concerning who gets to run, who gets to lead, who gets to front tickets? Is it the people? Is it this amorphous the people? Is it the people who are most disadvantaged? Is it the poorest? Is it the angry underbelly? Ironically, you might say Trump is really the first instance of a sort of grassroots-led movement of usurping that succeeded in usurping and overthrowing the sort of long entrenched control of the RNC over the Republican candidate selection process. But as I explained earlier on, what's really gone on here is replacement of an old elite with a new elite within the GOP. Whereas if you look at the Democrats, I could not name a single, quote unquote, bona fide outsider candidate who's managed to take the sort of leading role to front a ticket and win, apart from maybe Barack Obama. But you've got to recognize that Barack was not really, at the end of the day, a complete outsider. He had the right credentials. He came from the right background. He went through, and I'll give him a lot of credit. He went through all the necessary credentialist stages to get to where he was. And what he did most impressively was he threw his name into the ring and he said, I'm here to offer change. But in his actual, despite his rhetoric pledging change and his presence offering change and his demeanor signaling change, but in practice, he was so fundamentally intertwined and embedded with the certain sort of, northeastern, right, the northeast and east coast Democratic lobby and caucus, that he had a support base for the work that he was doing. That there was, in fact, establishment backing again for the work that he was trying to undertake. All of this is to say that the American political system, right, is at the end of the day a fundamentally money politics centric exercise that rewards those who are able to, sing the tune, dance to the tune, and also replicate the tune of the elite, the money elite, the power elite, and also the wealthy, who have been able to straddle both sides of the aisle for a very long while, up until Donald Trump, right? Who proved to them that A, hedging no longer worked, and secondly, sycophancy was the only thing that be rewarded, total loyalty and total compliance, especially during Trump 2.0. That's what's going to be rewarded and prized. And that finally, what he's offering here is replacement of an old elite with a new elite, so to speak. So in short, Philip, you asked me if it was capitalism that's to blame here. I don't think so. To me, capitalism is an incredibly powerful tool of liberation. It liberates individuals from the shackles of state bureaucracies, of centralized planning, of top-down, and in many ways, deeply insidious, right, ideological entrenchment. There's a reason why the Soviet Union collapsed, and it is not just in virtue of successful infiltration and also very successful brinkmanship strategies adopted by Reagan and co. It is also the fact that a truly and wholly state-led planning economy cannot survive and weather the storms of or the vicissitudes of human nature, right? I do not believe that bona fide, pure, unadulterated socialism works. But what does work is socialism mixed in with capitalist institutions, or socialist institutions mixed in with capitalist norms, or hybrid systems that fuse together both schools of thought. But even then, there are concerns over accountability, right? If you allow a centralized state agency and bureaucracy to plan, to direct and supervise, and also to distribute resources, who's there to keep these decision makers in check? So I don't want to come across as an apologist for state domination and also control over economies. I too am very well aware of the economic arguments in favor of more decentralization. I'm a massive fan of Hayek. I've read many a defense from Friedman, to even the more, you might say, fringe views, right, along the lines of Hans Hermann Hoppe or Walter Block and whatnot, defending right-leaning and super right-wing libertarianism. And I like reading these books because they probe me to think beyond my comfort zone. But what I will nevertheless say is that just because we should abhor, just because there's something fundamentally questionable about a top-down, state-led approach to running an economy, does not justify an oligopoly, does not justify an oligarch-run and also managed economy that is nepotistic, that is cronyistic, that is ultimately kleptocratic. That is what I fear has become of America today.
But isn't that typically what the end game before you totally cleanse it again? When I say capitalism, I don't mean in the purest form that you and I are talking about necessarily. I'm thinking about unconstrained. There are no more guardrails. It's total liberal. You can do whatever you want, shift all the people out of the United States and get it all from Vietnam or wherever. What I'm saying is nothing wrong with that on the surface because they are doing it for capitalism. They are doing it to make the most money, the most efficient way, and to reward the shareholders at the highest return. I don't think that as a premise is wrong, but there's no balance anymore, right? And so the end result is this lack of constraint, right? There's always this constraint issue. But, I totally agree with you. I mean, certainly I'm not knocking capitalism in any way. I'm wondering, has it gone in a different direction than what its purest form intended to do?
Yes. I think very quickly, because I'm aware that we might want to cover other topics as well. But
Yes.
Philip, I would say this. The problem with contemporary discourses of capitalism is that there's a lot of emphasis upon nominal rights, sort of the abstract, fictional, fictitious rights, property rights, ownership rights, rights to profit, rights to commercialize,
Right.
but not enough grappling with what I call the substantive and perhaps the more positive elements of freedoms. Self-actualization, right? The ability to lead meaningful lives as opposed to working as a corporate slave, toiling away perennially, okay? Or the freedom to be educated, to receive new information, to climb the ladder, as opposed to merely a sort of, well, we're not touching you, you're not touching us, we're not interfering with you, you're not interfering with us, and that's enough,
Yes.
right? The sort of fixation upon negative freedoms, and only even at that, a very cursory and superficial grappling with that I find alarming, because ultimately capitalism is supposed to be liberating of the individual, and the individual is not complete if the individual lives as a slave to corporation,
Pursuit of
as a
happiness.
slave to precarity, as Judith Butler puts it, as a slave, right, to sentiments and emotions that drive them as opposed to deeper and more rational deliberation and reflection. So that's my philosopher's hat on. I've got that on, and I hope that makes sense.
That's why you're so interesting, because your approach is multifaceted. It's not a singular aspect, but really multi-discipline approach to looking at the world. So I will end this section by saying the old saying that America is the best democracy money can buy. That just tells you the elitism, the corruption, and everything else that could go with it. I'm not saying it is right now, but I think everybody wants to know, how is this going to end? And using the word end without giving you a time frame is a foolishness to say how it ends, because time by definition doesn't end. So how do you feel? Let me give a more of a contextual discussion about right now. In my opinion, when I first started asking the question, was that really the number one target for the U.S. Tariff is really at China. And it is a form of decoupling that's going on now. If you're talking about 145% tariff, which is basically nobody will buy anything at that. And I think that is interesting how China, on the other hand, said this is a joke. If you go any higher, it's ridiculous. We're going to stop thinking about it because it's silliness. My feeling, and I kind of posted on LinkedIn on a couple of comments of other people, that I said, look, China has been thinking about dual circulation, at least publicly talking, since 2020, as far as I can recall. And this dual circulation requires, the export-driven outer circulation and the internal consumption, better standard of living, better consumption, better all the other things, safety net, social safety net, all that. They've been thinking, obviously, if not planning, for 4 or 5 years. Number one. I think it's probably even longer than that, but I'm not a China expert. Number two, it's my understanding that China, post-COVID lockdown, have never took out what the Westerners will call it the bazooka. They didn't come up with $60 trillion to like the post-global financial crisis. They didn't do that. They were very cautious. They were very, very measured in their steps, and they were often criticized for that. And on top of that, the real estate debacle was engineered because of all kinds of reasons, along with other
necessary deleveraging.
Exactly.
Very much necessary.
Exactly. They're trying to control the deleveraging. Now, some of it is controllable, some of it isn't, and nonetheless, there were all kinds of reasons without going into, because we can spend hours on that. But now, I believe that last year, a lot of people were thinking about, well, it's time for China to do it again, yank out that bazooka. And I've never seen a bazooka, so I don't really know what a bazooka looks like, but that's all right. So, but they didn't do it. And I think that my understanding was that they are waiting for this particular event, Liberation Day. They didn't know it's called Liberation Day. They didn't know 145, whatever it is. But perhaps now is the time that they will continue to try to do the circulation, the outer circulation, the Silk Road, revival and the One Belt, One Road and all the other things. But they are also going to understanding the legitimacy of the party is required to make sure that people don't fall off the cliff, and that the stability of their citizens is indeed necessary for them to continue. And it's at a point where it's just coupled with what's going on for the United States that they are probably going to spend much more energy and much more money, perhaps the bazooka, to help to lift the society up. And it's a natural developmental of a country economically to go that direction. And so, do you think, first of all, do you think that may be true and the validity of what I'm saying? Number two, that ultimately, if indeed that's true, is actually helping China to move in that direction, to mature as a developing country into a developed country and advanced economy and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
What's your thought on all that?
Thank you, Philip. There's a lot to unpack there. But what I would say is the Chinese political leadership ultimately is patient. I don't think they are necessarily long-termist, right, thinking in terms of centuries or millennia.
Yes, no.
I also reject the sort of essentialization that says all Chinese think, they think along super long time horizons. Not true.
Except you and me.
Right. Well, in my case, not really, because I get very impatient when I'm waiting for my wonderful Luckin coffee, which I can buy at 1/10 the price of a Starbucks coffee.
Yes.
And Luckin in China and Starbucks in America. I know they're not particularly comparable, but I'm just trying to say that the prices are much cheaper in even tier 2, tier 3 cities in China. But that's an aside.
No question.
Ultimately, the issue that the Chinese leadership is facing today, and the biggest challenge for them, is not so much the question of growth rates, but it is instead youth unemployment, which is a problem that could well lead to socio-political instability if mismanaged.
Yes.
And in order to revitalize youth employment, but also to bolster China's resilience in the wake of the escalating tariff wars and protectionism and barriers to trade, not just propped up by America, but also by a roster of other countries as well, I think the Chinese leadership is well cognizant of the need to bolster domestic consumption. You read the Central Economic Planning Work Conference last year, you read the statements of senior government officials at Lianghui this year, and you also look at all the sort of Politburo statements from September last year onwards. They tell you, they're very transparent, right? They're not hiding anything. They say the priority is to bolster domestic consumption.
Right.
And I think ultimately this is going to require the leadership to undertake 3 structural fixes in a directions of the economy, which I'm cautiously optimistic that it can. The first is to basically address for once and for all the sort of center periphery or central government, provincial government / local government financial imbalances that right now currently basically create a situation where the central government is incredibly under-leveraged, right? Super low leverage ratios. The debt to GDP ratio is less than 40% when it comes to central government. I can assure you of that. Whereas on the other hand, there's certain provinces and local governments where they have debt ratios or debt to GDP ratios as high as 290%. So rebalancing of these finances and ensuring that local governments and provincial governments can retain more of these tax collected revenues is crucial. But that is not going to come, and I'm going to say this out loud here, it's not going to come without what the leadership perceives to be necessary fixes to the leadership structures and the personnel helming the provinces, helming the cities and also localities. Only upon the sort of settling of the dust over personnel swaps are we going to see, a genuine activation of what I call a local to central governmental debt transfer process that in turn, alleviates the debt burdens on many of the most debt distressed provinces. That's not going to happen until at the earliest the end of this year, or alternatively the beginning of 2026. And the Chinese leadership, I repeat, they can wait. Right? They understand and recognize the pain and stress tolerance levels of the Chinese people, and they're incredibly high.
Yes.
Secondly, building up a robust safety net. Right? Social welfare in China has long languished under sort of wariness towards welfarism, the size of the population, but also just concerns that, any and all sort of transfer payments that are handed out could well be detracting from more quote-unquote productive or politically utile investments into infrastructure and also manufacturing, especially in light of the past 15 years of economic transformations. And yet, I reckon if you look at the minutes and also the readouts from many of the key meetings conducted last year, starting from the July Politburo meeting and also the third plenum statements, then through, of course, the readout in September, where the Politburo affirmed the then recent and nascently unveiled measures aimed at revitalizing market sentiments, all the way through to more recent statements coming out of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a top think tank, really, on policy making for China, as well as 那个国务院研究室, which is the state council, sort of research organ, right? That's headed up by a leader or a bureaucratic leader who's recently transferred to that post from Hainan. It was the name of Shen Danyang. These are all technocrats, by the way. These are folks who understand how to govern efficaciously. And they've just said it's high time to build up a more robust safety net.
Yes.
Okay, to reform and engage in an overhaul to the hukou system, to think about how 农民工, in other words, incredibly impoverished and currently, for lack of a better word, the lumpen proletariat, right, who are displaced and who are rootless in cities and urban areas, how their welfare can be catered to. And estimates have put it at up to 300 million 农民工 in China today. So these are all issues that the leadership is willing to and keen on tackling, because without a safety net, without improvements to the welfare system that are structural, folks won't spend.
Right.
Households will not spend. Savings ratio would remain incredibly high. And that ties me on to the final prong, which I think the leadership is aware of the need to tackle, but is perhaps still experimenting with different methods with regards to the actual implementation of the change in question. And that is the revitalization of corporate confidence. Let's put it this way. The past few years of necessary transitions and also economic overhauls in China, and I would say they're necessary because they really were. The real estate was over-leveraged, education tech was driving up prices of education, and also, fostering this incredibly involuted and vicious form of competition amongst parents seeking to one-up one another in an education arms race. These are all problems that the government had every right to tackle, but the side effect, and a corollary effect of this was that many in the private sector, whether they be investors, entrepreneurs, startup founders, they felt super, super disoriented, discombobulated even by the changes and the vacillations in policies. So what the government needs to do right now is to send out a clear and also unfettered signal to the private sector. We are sincere and we are committed to delivering for you. We will build up a better intellectual and property rights regime. We will respect your boundaries and your own prerogatives. We will acknowledge your autonomy and agency. These are messages that must be emphatically delivered and conveyed in order to bolster and revitalize the confidence of not just consumers, but also the private sector at large and across the board. And with that said, I hope, with these prongs in mind, that the Chinese economy would gradually, orient itself towards a more sustainable and also resilient pathway that can weather whatever is thrown at them. And mind you, just a quick response to your frame, Philip, concerning the strategy or the strategic play coming from, the American side. I wouldn't read too much into Trump's quote-unquote strategy. I wouldn't read too much into this sort of the recent U-turn, flip-flop, U-turn again, and say, oh, this was a grand plan. To me, that is, it's spin. It's Scott Bessent spinning what Trump is doing. What Trump probably wanted to do, and when he was rolled out these tariffs in the first place, was to engineer a paradigm shift in global trade, because he was listening to Peter Navarro and thought, this guy makes a lot of sense, right? Despite his made-up economic advisor, Ron Vera, anyway. So Trump probably thought, great idea, I'm going to do it. And then upon seeing the bond markets, he freaked out. So he said, I'm not going to do it, all right? But how could he cover for and how could he account for the capitulation? He needed a spin. He needed a story. And that was where Scott Bessent, as probably the most competent man in that entire cabinet, walked in and said, I have a plan. We're going to frame this as a grand plan against China.
Right.
Against China.
Yes.
And that in turn was what came out of the White House, right? And even then, when it came to the 145 tariffs, they offered exemptions, right? They announced exemptions over the weekend. And then last night, Trump said, oh, actually, no, it was not. There were no exemptions. We're going to still impose the same amount of tariffs. So no one knows what's going on, right? You speak with folks who try to track these tariffs, and it would say, where do I start? Because honestly, I don't know either. Where do we start? Where do we finish? Well, we're going to see a lot of fluctuation over the coming months. That's for sure. And if there's one thing I can say with relative certainty, is that there is no cohesive and coherent strategy. There might be tactics. There might be, very, very smart tactics. I don't deny that. But I really don't think there is a coherent grand strategy at work here.
In conclusion, then, I think that remain to be seen what the outcome is. But it sounds like what you are saying is that China is more than aware of this, obviously, and China is going at its own pace. We have talked about, you have spoken eloquently about the ability to withstand pain. That's a cultural thing, you want to call that privilege. So I think this story will continue, and thank you very much for sharing a far greater landscape than I have asked, and really appreciate that. And perhaps we will have the privilege of having you on again to look at part 2 of this awful event.
That would be my absolute pleasure. My absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being my guest for this podcast, and we look forward to spending more time.
Thank you very much, Philip. Likewise. Thank you.
You can always find more episodes by visiting philipchow.us/podcast, or find us on your favorite podcast app. You can always leave us feedback, ask questions, or request a topic for us to discuss by sending an email to pc@philipchow.us.
Views expressed in the Tao of Chao podcast are individual opinions, and they do not represent the employers of each guest or the firm each guest is associated. Our podcasts are for educational and informational purposes only and should not be deemed or viewed as investment advice or recommendations. Please consult your personal financial advisor, investment expert, or investment fiduciary before taking any actions about your plan and investments.